J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels. As you know, we are broadcasting internationally, of course, with our home base, UPRN, and their FM affiliate that they own, 107.7 Maine, as well as multiple AM stations around the world. And another affiliate is also the Program Radio Network in London and Leeds. Now, we always strive to bring you the greatest information, the most important information that you all who are on the fence of believing certain things will actually wake up and start to pay attention to what's been happening around us for not just decades, but even centuries, even millennia, if you think about that. Now, today, we have a very special guest. This is a topic that I've wanted to devote an entire show on for literally going on 7 years. Today, we're going to be talking about George Adamski, one of the original contactees in the 20th century. The case of George Adamski truly stands the test of time. Now, we do know George Adamski has passed away, but that does not mean his legacy is not alive and well, even today, especially with his photographs, the imagery that he's got. And that is one of the great reasons why I had to reach out to the CEO and director of the Adamski Foundation, Mr. Glenn Steckling. Glenn, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Dr. J, and thank you to all of your listeners as well. It's a privilege and an honor to be on the air with you.
The privilege is all mine, Glenn, definitely. It's definitely all mine and the listeners, for that matter. Before we dive into George himself, let's talk about you, Glenn. How did you first get involved with Adamski and the Foundation?
Well, my family had tracked UFOs already since the end of World War II, and we had a number of sightings in the United States prior to 1963 when we had met George Adamski. In fact, we had witnessed a bell-shaped craft over downtown Washington, about 1,500 feet. And there were about 30 other witnesses, including the reporter of the Washington Daily News. And that was March of '63, and so that was in the paper shortly thereafter. And after all these sightings, my father said, well, I'm going to the Library of Congress. And he started alphabetically, under Adamski, fact section, not fiction. And he found the books Flying Saucers Have Landed and Inside the Spaceships, in which George had very clear and concise, verifiable photos of these craft taken both through the telescope and camera, but also motion picture footage. So we wrote to George, and he was coming in the summer to lecture to the Air Force Reserves in Washington, and he had a large number of engagements along the East Coast during the last 2 years of his life, in which we helped to arrange a number of it. So we became his close friend and confidant, and eventually the inheritors of the foundation and all the materials and copyrights. And so I can truly say that I have been immersed in this field since a very young age, and it's now over 50 years, half a century of researching, promoting, and educating people on what actually happened. I don't deal with the science fiction and the fantasy land that's so prevalent in today's UFO circles, where everything is made up and nothing has any foundation or source. We deal right from the basis. So my father and mother went to NASA Goddard with 22 scientists in 1967, invited, and they discussed this pictures and these craft, and the scientists knew all about them, the propulsion system and who pilots them and which planets they come from. 3 months later, Colonel Freeman from the Pentagon asked for the same audience, and we did that as well. And so we were highly active in the 60s and 70s, in the, towards the relative beginning of this film. People like Frank Edwards, Colonel Freeman, and Stanton Freeman, and so many others come from that era where there was substance to this subject, and that's what I grew up with. And so over the years, we have gone to the British House of Lords and revealed information, and the stamps that Prime Minister Gary Grenada put out, because he was highly supportive of this. My father supplied the pictures, in which you have a copy of those stamps, and you can see. And so we have worked diligently with our publications and our research on the moon, and thereafter that I think that we can firmly say that there's a great deal of reality and fact that's available to the public if they truly want it.
For those people who aren't entirely familiar when George passed away, can you tell us when that happened?
He passed away in April of 1965. He spent his last birthday with us about a week beforehand, and he subsequently buried in Arlington National Cemetery due to his service in the military in the United States Cavalry during the early 1900s.
And, 54 years coming soon in April.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yep. And so, like I said before, it is the reason that Adamski resonates, both pros and con. Pros are because the pictures are so good and verified. And there's a new book out now that I collaborated with a fellow out of Denmark. It's called I have it here on my desk, the George Adamski Story, Historical Events of Gigantic Implications, in which the pictures, the original negatives I submitted for rescanning and examination, and we found the fact that the crafts fly behind the trees, so that can't be faked, and so on and so forth. So all the accusations that they used to throw at George have been peeled away and discarded by anybody who looks at the actual facts.
Let me ask you a question. When did George Adamski start to have these? I know he had a giant telescope on Mount Palomar, which for those people who are across the globe should know that this is in San Diego County. Am I right, Glenn?
That's correct. In the Hale Observatory, the 200-inch telescope resides on top of the mountain as well.
When did he first start having contacts with these extraterrestrials? And one thing I may add to this question is the evolution of the contactees, meaning that the people that were visiting the contactees. For instance, George was always being told that these beings are from Venus and things like that, whereas it evolved through time to become other planets, other galaxies, other dimensions, other timelines, etc. And so let's take that in two parts. First, when did he start? And second, do you know why they were talking about coming from Venus?
Well, the beginning was really George was involved in philosophical teachings in the 1930s. And it was during this time that one of his students gave him the first telescope, the 6-inch telescope. And actually, it was even written up in the LA Times, 1938, April of 1938, a picture of him with his new telescope. A 6-inch telescope, as most people know, is not all that big. You can buy that, locally as an amateur, but it still gives you some decent viewing. Later on, when he got up to Mount Palomar, then he built himself a 15-inch, which is quite larger. And so his interest already, I would say, began when he was a young man, and he talked about the principles of life, chemical evolution, and things like this. So when he began to view these crafts over LA, and if you recall historically, there are a number of articles of which they were UFOs sighted over the skies of LA that caused quite a stir because we were going into World War II or already in it. And there was great concern. So he wasn't the first, but he had taken some pictures at that time and sent it into the government. And that was just prior to World War II starting up. That was 1940. And with everything that accelerated from that time, everything got put a little bit on the shelf. And so as time went by and he got closer here to the mountains and the other areas here and set up larger equipment, he started to take more photos. And these photos then were submitted to the government, to the military, to anybody who wanted them. He gave it freely away to people who came up to visit and what have you. He wanted the most wide exposure through all avenues. Therefore, people could get the best information and then they could make the best decisions. And he worked with several laboratories concerning the electromagnetic propulsion of these crafts. You may remember the name T.T. Brown and Agnew Bonson as well. And so George became more and more immersed in this field. And after the Second World War, there was a little bit of relaxation time before we really became hyperactive in the atomic field. And so his visitors that came to visit, and it wasn't just from Venus and Saturn and Jupiter and Mars, other planets as well, came out of concern for the atomic testing. And if you look in the LA Times, I've got some beautiful archives, copies of UFO seen, 200-foot UFO seen over the hydrogen bomb test site, so on and so forth. So this stuff was front page news at one particular point in time. These days, where everybody gets stuff on the internet, they have kind of forgotten what to do, as far as real research is concerned, and actually making up their own minds versus letting somebody else make it up for them.
One little known fact, which I know you're able to talk about, is that George Adamski held, I don't know what the name of the card was, but he had access to go in and out of the White House, and I believe in and out of the Vatican at will. What's that card called?
Well, it's not a diplomatic passport, because that's not the document that does that. He did have an access card to the White House, which he showed us. George Adamski briefed President Eisenhower in 1958. He took him to an air base out here in the desert of California, in which one of these craft landed, and Eisenhower was briefed face-to-face. Part of that, I believe, was the push to instigate NASA thereafter to get us as a society and civilization into space. And then in 1960, George offered an invitation to then Vice President Nixon and to John Kennedy during their election run. And just before taking the nomination, Nixon declined, but John Kennedy did not. He came and visited George, and they became friends, and eventually George was given the access card to the White House, in which he went several times to produce information and photographic information that was relevant to this country and its security and information. So George was also, as you mentioned, with the Vatican. He went prior to Pope John the 23rd's death. He delivered a sealed message from the space people to the Pope, in which the Pope gave him the Golden Medal of Honor, the Ecumenical II, Vatican II medal, which we have in our vaults, as recognition for that service. If you look into the picture phase here that you've got down towards the bottom, there's a book called Flying Saucer, Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery 2. Those are detailed in that particular reprinting, which we put out about 2 years ago. And it has a complete new section of all the photographs and documents of the people that George dealt with. We pulled them out of archives, which gave, of course, the critics and the skeptics a whole lot of difficulties, but, that's no big deal.
You mentioned the fact that there was somewhat of a lull during the atomic testing, but afterwards I know there was a surge, because a lot of people claim that the moment we started to detonate nuclear weapons, we essentially sent out an invitation, per se, to all the other beings, whether it be in this solar system, in another galaxy, and possibly even other dimensions, saying, hold on a second, the kids have found the matches. Because what did we do when we first found a way to divide the atoms or split an atom? We decided to build weapons of mass destruction. And I would think this is what caused the influx of extraterrestrial visitation. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, the old saying that it is easier to destroy than to create is only because we allow ourselves to resort to our baser instincts of our own personal ambition and greed and power, and thereby we misuse things rather than use it for a potential good. As far as the atomic bombs, it is measurable. Every time that one was exploded, the planet would ring like a bell, and these oscillating vibratory sound waves and frequency waves go off the planet and into space, like drop a pebble into a pond and you can see the waves radiate outward. And so not only were we causing ourselves immeasurable damage, because with each bomb the Earth slows down its rotation a little bit, and then of course with just some basic physics you understand that the Earth stays together due to its inner core and its rotation and its gravitation and compression. And you mess with that, and you mess with your own survivability. And so by experimenting with these things, and it's not like just we did one or two. We did thousands of them, both above ground, in the water, in the air, and so we
underground too.
Underground, and it's just incredible. And so we were destroying our own world. And what we don't understand is that everything in nature is a fine balance. The solar system and the sun is a fine balance. You cannot yank a planet out of its planetary orbit without creating an immense destruction of the other planets and their orbits as well. So in our immaturity, we have not only threatened ourselves, but if we destroyed our own world, we would destroy them as well, and that's not allowable. We're not allowed to be that stupid, or shouldn't be.
When I picture the visitors that George Adamski was in contact with, they all look like the perfect human, and I say that in quotes, meaning muscular, I believe blue eyes, possibly blonde hair. But the point is you don't see them as being overweight or things like that. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely not. The particular individual that George met out in the desert and was documented in the Phoenix Gazette and the Oceanside Tribune with 6 other witnesses in November of 1952 was of a gentleman who was in a flight suit and who had Mediterranean kind of complexion, a little bit olive-colored, like beginnings of a suntan. And in this particular case, he had blue eyes and longer hair. But if you read George's material, you will find that he discusses meeting people of various sizes and races, color hair, men and women. So it has absolutely no relationship to this attempt by many in this field as to accuse George of, dealing with so-called Nordics or any relations to the Germans or the Nazis. That's all pure garbage. And so, as you know, the diversity of human beings on this planet, whether it's the Watusi or the Pygmies or anywhere else you go, the different races on this world, we have people that are anywhere from 4 feet high to over 7 feet high. And so that diversity exists beyond this world as well, because life is universal. It is not any particular sovereignty to this world by any stretch of the imagination.
You mentioned November of 52, but clearly he had sightings of the craft, and I believe with the actual beings themselves long before that. Is that correct?
That's true.
When did they start?
Oh, well, let's just say that he had exposure through a great deal of his life, and that exposure grew as he proved himself to be not only of good moral character and strength. This was a subject he would never sell out. He would never market or profiteer off of. Most of his books were published, given without any royalties, and he simply let that be that way because he thought that the information far exceeded the need to be, the pompous individual or personality that was going to be the promoter. And that's something you don't see these days. Everybody's out there, me, I, and blah, 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 blah. And that's why we've gone nowhere in the last 40 years in this field. The message has become lost purposely. I think the great deal of misinformation and misdirection propagates right from the UFO community. They are the worst when it comes to this sort of thing because they're fighting each for their own little sovereignty and their own little idea, and with very little evidence, very little facts. It's just, believe me what I say, and that's it. And so I find that rather ludicrous in some regards.
A lot of people have actually labeled George Adamski as being the ambassador to humanity, meaning that the ETs would tell him something, show him how technology works, possibly show him what the future lies if we went down this path that we were continuing with the atomic bombs. What do you say with regards to people who call George Adamski the unofficial extraterrestrial ambassador to humanity, even though he was a human, he was the one that was given more knowledge and had more contacts in that era than anyone else I could think of.
Yes, I would say that he was regarded as Earth's representative in this particular field, and he did this work quietly. He was offered a seat on the UN by U Thought, and he turned it down. And he said, because once I take an official title or position, then I'm told what I can say and what I cannot say. And he says that's not how the truth works. And so George was, as you see one of the articles that you posted on here, the first ambassador of space that came out, and that was talked about. Also, there was an article that came out in the Far East when George did his world tour, and discussed the fact that he was actually the first fellow into space and not our astronauts, because already in 1955, he described the firefly effect that John Glenn reported in 1963. George reported a light atmosphere around the moon, which is we know now to be true, that there are clouds and mists and water vapor and spraying geysers, which our own Apollo instruments have verified as well. All this stuff George revealed already in the 50s, long before we started our own space program. And so this also has helped to bolster the message he had to bring and the information he had to bring as well.
And just like you mentioned with the moon, Glenn, I have seen the color photographs of Life magazine, which show the moon to be far different than what NASA has shown us to be since then. I don't know how it came about to where Life was able to get these images, or how the CIA or whatever governing agency didn't step in to stop the publishing of these photos. But I have yet to see a single photograph released by NASA, published anywhere else, that showed the moon to be more Earth-like, meaning brown dirt, like almost literally like just sand dirt, as opposed to what we see in the sky. And even now, with the Chinese probe being on the dark side of the moon, I doubt that they'll ever show us what's really going on there. And you mentioned atmosphere. That is also a recurring theme that a lot of people seem to say, but yet the mainstream wants us to believe otherwise. This is speculation, of course, but do you have any idea why they're trying to suppress this knowledge about the moon for us?
Well, because we have a series of shall we say, factions that are involved with the promotion of information on this world. And it just doesn't extend to the UFO. It extends to politics and environment and everything else. And so you have a faction that wants to suppress everything and simply say, we told you how this is, and you're just going to have to take our word for it. You've got another group that says otherwise, because you have notable scientists and officials and government officials, people who said otherwise. And then you have a group that just releases information, and that information you have to look at, and you have to discern and research for yourself. We have become such a lazy society where everything has to be put on a plate, made palatable to our own particular phase of mind and thinking at any particular time, and that's what we're going to accept. Except for that's not how anything works that way. It never works that way. You have to go and you have to look and research and read and discern for yourself, and not just take my word or anybody else's. I provide you the proof. Here are the NASA photos. They're on the website. The backside of the moon on one orbit here, you see a huge luminescence device here on the surface illuminating hundreds of square miles. You've got an area where you've got material pouring from one crater to the next. You have to have atmosphere to sustain it. If you look at the chronological listings from NASA concerning the moon that was published in '67, they talk about clouds, mists, moving lights, colored lights. Then you look at the releases that came from '71, 14 hours worth of water geysers spraying out of the surface. Then you look at the evidence of the astronaut Young with his pack on, weighing probably about 275 pounds, unable to jump more than 20 centimeters high. In a 1/6 gravity, that's impossible. You would jump meters and meters high and forward. And so there's a well-known fact that the moon sustains a higher gravity. And it's a well-known fact that these planetary bodies, whether it be planets or satellites or whatever, they are in a composition that also sustains life, because that's how it works in space. All the materials that compose life. You talk to any biochemist, and they will tell you that all the materials that sustain life surround us in space. And these materials, these organic materials, bombard our planet by the number of about 2 tons a day. And that's why we got meteorite specimens from Mars and Antarctica and vice versa. We're trading organic material. And if you think that you got anything special than anybody else, then you better start thinking again.
Agreed. And this just goes to show about the massive cover-up that not only has been going on for decades, but is still going on, I'd say more than half a century later. Now, going back again to November 1952, let's rewind back the clock a little bit. What was the first contact George Adamski had, and was it just seeing a craft that was maneuvering in ways that literally cannot be compared to what we have on Earth? Or was that very first contact or the sighting ended up landing and a being coming out and talking to him?
The first publicized event was on November 20th, 1952.
Okay, so that was 52. Yes.
That's right. And that was out at Desert Center in the California desert, and not far from Joshua Tree and 29 Palms and these other places. It's easy to find on the map. And then what happened was they noticed a cigar-shaped craft up in the sky. And there was also a reconnaissance flight out of the military base near the Salton Sea that was reported in Project Blue Book of saying a same kind of craft at the same time over the Desert Center area reported by the U.S. military. So there's collaborating evidence, non-partial right there. Then there were 6 other witnesses, and as they watched this craft maneuver, out from underneath it dropped a glowing object that later came down and sat down in front of them behind the hill, and George walked up to it. And in the new book, the one I just mentioned by Renee Olson, the examination of the photographs also reveal that individual walking towards George as well. So, and the pictures from that time reveal the mother craft and the other crafts as well. So we've had new decades worth of photographic analysis, and they all have come out pro-positive for George and that event as well. And that craft landed, and that individual that you see here, and you scroll down your photos towards the bottom, the last row of pictures on the left-hand side is a painting, which hangs here in my office, of this particular individual. And it's about an 80% likeness. And so they communicated by drawing in the sand there along the dry riverbed, and the individual also left behind footprints in which symbols are engraved at the bottom of the shoe, and those were made plaster casts of, and they were examined, and they are having to do with the propulsion system of the craft. And so that was the first public particular circumstance where he met him. And then he met him several times thereafter, and others in which he was picked up and then taken and flown up into space, and talked about what we have mentioned earlier inside the spaceships. And so his exposure was about as good as you can get.
Now, it wasn't just males who he had contact with. I believe there were females that George Adamski had contact with as well, right?
Absolutely. Humanity is humanity no matter where you go. As we mentioned before, men and women of many different races, sizes, and colors and complexions. It's not any different out there than it is here on this world.
What can you tell us that the extraterrestrials told George Adamski when he had these contacts? Were they giving him a knowledge or warning him about what we're doing to this planet or things of that nature?
Both. several things. First of all, it was time for us to go into the space age, not only for our own education and awareness of how our own planet works, as well as safety concerns. Once we went into space and put our satellites up, all the space age technology is what's keeping you safe when hurricanes come and typhoons and all kinds of weather changes or solar winds, solar flares. All of this vast amount of knowledge of how our planet works and the beginnings of how we begin to understand what goes on in space has come from the space age. So their initial arrival had to do with the fact that we were reaching a technological state where we could start the beginnings of our own space program, and that they wanted to help us along with. Also, they needed to warn us about certain things like the destructiveness of the atomic age and the possibilities that came from that. And to my knowledge, they have interceded in 2 potential atomic conflicts and prevented that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today. So I would say that those are 2 things. The other things they bring us is their understanding of life. They've been traveling space for tens of thousands of years and have been exposed to life all throughout the cosmos. Their scientific knowledge of not only technology, but the science of life itself is so far beyond us we cannot even begin to imagine it. It's not that it's not there for us. We are not just underlings like some people promote and say, oh, we're too stupid to understand. Oh, no, we're not too stupid to understand. We're too stupid to make a decision to do something of something betterment. And so they brought that as well. And they wanted to let us know that they were there nearby in order to help us if we wanted it. They could have taken over this planet so long ago it's not even funny. And they can have it today in a snap of a finger. And so that proves in itself that they're not aggressive. And so when we hear so much aggressiveness in the UFO field today, so much bizarrity and negativity, that comes from our own imaginations. That has absolutely nothing to do with the extraterrestrial visitors.
I'm glad you pointed out the fact that if they really wanted our planet, they could have had us. They could have had the planet very easily. Instead of dropping, say, a destructive weapon that would destroy the terrain of the planet Earth, they could have easily found a way to kill off Homo sapiens, leaving other life around, and having this beautiful piece of real estate that we call Earth. And again, Glenn, just like you said, this is more proof that had they wanted this planet, it could have been taken. Now, a lot of people who are listening to this, when they think of human-looking extraterrestrials, the next question that comes into play is, well, are they walking amongst us? Do you know if that's the case? Meaning, did George Adamski ever mention that, hey, these ETs that look very much human are in fact walking amongst us humans right now and maybe even hold high positions in government, UN, etc.?
Sure. George talked about that all the time. He introduced us to a number of them. We had carried on friendships with them after he passed away. When my father was talking to a group of scientists, their primary question was, how many extraterrestrials that look like you or I are walking amongst us? My father wrote down a number on a piece of paper, and the lead scientist wrote down his number, and they swapped them out, and they were relatively the same number. So it's not like we don't know. And yes, I knew one. I knew one that was a park ranger outside the White House, one in the State Department, one that was in the clergy. They come for a brief period of time, usually about 2 years. It could be very much described like our own Peace Corps. And they spend a bit of time amongst us. They learn how, for them it's a historical lesson. There's no such thing as time travel. That's nothing but fantasy. But what they do is they come to a society as they once were thousands of years ago. So they get to see how they were once and how they thought and how they reached conclusions and moved certain directions. So it's a history lessons for them. And so not only that, they also put themselves in an area where they can promote certain pieces of information when the time becomes necessary. There was a newspaper reporter in Washington, editor we knew in Washington, And when this was a very big subject in the 60s, he was talking to a couple of his reporters about UFOs and ETs and how they look and all this other stuff. And so, brand new guy, was just hired just a few weeks before, comes into the office and listens to the conversation. And he says to my father's friend, the editor, he says, "In your desk drawer you have a railroad pike." And for people who are unfamiliar, that's about 9 inches long, made of thick iron, probably an inch in circumference. And he says, "Why don't you take it out of your drawer, which is locked?" And so the editor, first thing he says, "Well, how do you know what's in my locked drawer?" He says, "Just open it up and take it out." So he takes it out and he hands it to him, and the guy puts his finger on the top of it and pushes all 9 inches of it right into this desk all the way through. And he smiles at everybody and walks away. And boy, were they ready to interrogate him when he came to work the next day. Of course, he never showed up. But it answered the question in the thoughts and the conversation of the people that were having it at that particular time. And that happens whether it's in the Vatican or whether any other denomination or within the government and what have you. There are times when we are more receptive, and then there are times we are not. Here in this country right now, we're in a time, and this has nothing to do with the political situation, because this has already been for the last 30 years. In the last 30 years, we're in a time of being resistant to anything that interrupts with our own predetermined desires and plans of how things should be run.
You mentioned JFK. A lot of people subscribe to the theory that the reason he was assassinated by people within the United States government, mainly the CIA or Clowns in America, Cocaine Import Agency, whatever you want to call it, was because he was about to make a speech that would have publicly told the world that, hey, not only are we not alone, we are being visited. Do you know anything about that?
Well, John Kennedy was no fool, and he knew the electorate very well. And the reason that John Kennedy was killed is multifold. First of all, he resisted the CIA, having to do with the Bay of Pigs, and he fired all the military people who had carried over some policies during the Dulles regime that came out of the Eisenhower administration. So he, for the lack of a better word, ticked off a whole bunch of high-ranking people. And then, of course, he got into the face of U.S. Steel when they were going to hold the country ransom for a pay increase after they had swatted down labor. And he wanted to go back to the gold standard. And there's a number of reasons. These changes in themselves were the main reason that we plotted to assassinate our own president. The UFO situation was not even on that list. And I know plenty of people in this field who have tried to squeeze and wring that particular thought and theory out as the main reason, and that's absolutely nonsense.
Other people also mentioned because JFK had personal relations with Marilyn Monroe that she was privy to the knowledge about extraterrestrials that JFK was. Is that
pure
just a rumor?
Speculation.
Pure speculation.
Pure speculation by people who like to make innuendo without being able to supply any substance or any proof. Miss Monroe was bipolar. She was unstable emotionally. She had been on drugs for a number of years, along not only prescribed medication, but other kinds as well. John Kennedy was no fool. He's not going to tell somebody about something of this magnitude simply because they happen to have a fling. I mean, come on. This is people once again trying to do Enquirer type stories in order to bring more significance to her, which there wasn't any, and so on and so forth. When George took John Kennedy out into the desert, there were only three people: George, Bobby, and John, and she had nothing to do with any of it.
Now, you mentioned, of course, 1952 is when he started to have the sightings and visitations and interaction with these ETs. And I'm assuming this literally went up to his death in 1965. Is that whole 13-year period full of consistent sightings and visitations?
Absolutely. So consistent that people that went to go up and visit George up in Mount Palomar actually witnessed the craft land there as well. And so not only did they see the ships, they got close to the ships. They were able to photograph them. There were other people who took photographs of these crafts at that location other than George. And the more he worked in the field, the greater the support he got. He took 2 world tours, 59 and 63. And these people accompanied him as he went on these tours. And everywhere he went, the newspapers are full of people who had seen these crafts or photographed them, whether it's New Zealand, Australia, the Far East, London, Europe. He went before Queen Juliana, was invited to talk with her in the Netherlands. No one in this field has had the access and the availability of actual information of any substance as compared to George. It's just a fact. Now, he's not the only contactee. You've got Van Tassel. You've got who else have you got here? Reinhard Schmidt. You got the 2 sisters in Norway, the woman in South Africa, so on and so on forth. Because the space people aren't stupid. They're not going to just take one person and make it as an idle incident. They covered the globe. They contacted people all over the world, some who went public, some of them who did not. But there's hardly a newspaper archive in any city in any country that doesn't have reports and or photographs in their microfiche of these crafts during a certain period of history. So,
how many times would you say George was invited onto the craft and was taken on trips, essentially?
Oh, I can't even tell you how many, more than I can count. I know that in February of '65, when the Silver Springs film was taken, in which you have a couple of stills of it here, just above the book Why Are They Here?, which is my father's first book. There's a craft, one of the frames of one of the crafts, and maneuvering, and it retracts and extends one of the 3 ball condensers on the bottom. You go directly to the right-hand side, there's another frame from that as well. So that particular film was taken, and my father arranged the International Press Conference the first week of March of '65, in which all the ambassadorial staff and the major networks, Huntley and Brinkley, all those people were there, and they were just simply astonished by the type of crafts and maneuverability. There was constant footage which moves that craft at such a speed that if it did not exist within an electromagnetic encased field, that it keeps it at permanently 1 gravity. If we did things like we do it, it would be 120 G's or gravitational forces, which was impossible for any human to sustain more than 10 G's usually. And so, like I said, he was in space so many times, and he was given material and support right up to his passing. I remember once spending the afternoon with him, and people have to understand, this is just not haphazard stuff. Everybody walks around with a cell phone camera now. In those days, you had to have an 8 or 16 millimeter camera, which is a large, bulky device, practically glued in your hand if you wanted to get anything, and it had to be arranged. And I remember that George said to me, when my parents were out arranging something for him on the radio, he said, "Sit down, I've got 2 friends coming." And these 2 young gentlemen came in. They were both space people, and they sat down, and he said, "Listen and learn." And they started to have a conversation about when it was going to be ready for the particular craft to come by, time of day, conditions and whatever, to have the camera ready to go. Otherwise, nobody else of any validity has anything that matches George's films. I mean, these days, or in the last 20 years, shall we say, Photoshop has made many people famous on making a bunch of fake stuff.
You mentioned materials that were given to Adamski. Can you describe what types and sorts of material he was given by these extraterrestrials?
He collected some metals when he went out here into the desert and had one of his pickups. They were doing a repair on the flange of the Scout, and there were some melted metallic material that George picked up and put in his pocket. Pieces of that he ended up sending to Wilbert Smith, who was the Canadian scientist involved with Project Magnet, and the analysis went from there. Smith recognized and acknowledged the material but did not mention where he had gotten them from, which was really unimportant. So he had actually substance and material. He was also given a gift of a mineral, which is particular to the planet these people came from, and given to him as well. And then he had all the pictures and photos and motion picture and film, and I can only tell you that what he introduced us to, and those relationships and friendships that continued after George passed away, has helped us to sustain and promote this program without a single flinching of doubt. I can safely say, and this is not egotism speaking, I can safely say that I have been a witness to so much tangible proof, literally in front of my eyes, that I don't have to suffer from tangible doubt, which most people don't have that luxury, because inside them they keep thinking, well, NASA tells us there's no life beyond this planet, and this and that. And that's why I go around and try to inform the public and say, remember, NASA tells you that Venus is 800 degrees, yet the Russians say that their instrument says it's less than half that temperature. And so you got to wonder how difficult can a thermometer be. And then they say it's 8 times the density of boiling oil, and the winds are 400 miles an hour. And then they tell you we land parachutes of our probes onto the surface. Now, how is that physically possible?
As a skydiver myself, Glenn, I could tell you this. First of all, if the winds were blowing to that degree, the parachute would have A, collapsed, or B, literally being pushed or pulled to another direction. And the heat alone, if it was 800 degrees Fahrenheit, the parachute would have melted long before the probes would have landed. And so every time I hear that coming from NASA, and the way I'm sure you've heard this saying from Stanton Friedman and other peoples, NASA is not the best acronym, or the best way to describe NASA as NASA is never a straight answer. Because even to this day, NASA has a history of lying. And I feel that even though they're supposed to be a civilian, I don't want to say organization, but a civilian agency, for whatever reason, they are doing everything opposite of being in the best interests of us as far as humanity, not just United States humanity, but all of humanity across the entire globe.
Well, I am about a little bit of different thinking. First of all, my father was the same way. When he wrote the book Alien Bases on the Moon, he acknowledged the departments and the people who gave the access or directed him to the access to get the photographs, the microfiche, the catalogs of the pictures, in which then you have to order the 15 by 11 and pay for them and do the research yourself. They're not in the business of uncovering stuff for you. And there are a lot of people who work very hard and diligently. You know, this whole spiel about we didn't go to the moon is so asinine, it's almost not even worth talking about. I mean, these people, Mercury 7, strapped themselves onto literally time-released bombs to shoot themselves into space, in which they take the films on the way up there. The telescopes go up with them. When Apollo went to the moon, hundreds of land-based telescopes tracked it to the moon. And when you look through the 200 Hale-inch telescope, you can see the remnants of the LEM and other devices sitting on the lunar surface. So these people who say, well, look, the flag waved, so it must have been in a studio, are total idiots, because the atmospheric wind on the moon moved the flag, not some studio. So they don't do any research to sustain. They just simply make the accusation and say, ha, 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 this is how it must be. So NASA has done a hell of a lot of work in order to educate the people. They're just not giving you everything you want. And sometimes that material comes out in a way where you have to look at it yourself and not have somebody stand up once again on the podium and say, ho, 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 look what we found. And so that's a two-edged sword when we start making accusations, because they have given us a great deal of knowledge. It's not just all of it which we expect and would hope for. So then we have to do a little work. Well, guess what? That's life.
That's right. That's right. And for those people who don't believe we've ever gone to the moon, I think people like the Edgar Mitchell, who sadly passed away a few years ago, great friend of mine, he is not lying, not just talking about the times I've actually had the opportunity to interview him on record, but all the conversations we've had off the record, meaning not on a radio show, just personally. There is no way that poor guy or any of those astronauts made up that story and toed a line of NASA to say, hey, we never made it to the moon, but let's just pretend we did. Because it's actually very disgraceful and harming to tell these people that, hey, we know that your mission was supposed to be on the moon, but yet we don't believe it. I just couldn't even imagine what some of these astronauts who were on the moon would even feel other than purely distraught, just as Edgar Mitchell said. But I'm hopeful and thankful that most of the people do in fact believe the truth, that we were on the moon, that it was not staged, just like many people say Stanley Kubrick used his set from 2001: A Space Odyssey to record these moon landings. And just like you said, Glenn, about the flag, the American flag waving, to say that it was done in a studio, well, first of all, the studio may not necessarily have those kinds of winds if it's an enclosed studio. And also what you said about the atmosphere on the moon itself, well, why wouldn't the flag be waving? I mean, it's a little ludicrous, and that can open up a whole new can of worms. You mentioned bases on the moon, right?
Yep.
How many bases do you know of?
Well, I would say that if you look here, once again on the photographs, about halfway down, you see my father in Japan on nationwide television in '77. And right to the right of that, to the left of that, is a picture of Gassendi Crater, Gassendi Major. And that was taken in the 1930s. And you can see the lines, the straight lines of the tubular construction, both straight and curved, going across Gassendi Crater and out through the crater rim and continuing out on the lunar plateau on the other side. And so there was a statement made by the astronomers that they had watched the construction on Gassendi Major, and then many, many decades later, they also watched portions of it being deconstructed. So I would say we could say Gassendi Crater is extremely suspect. Also, as you mentioned, the astronauts, they were a little bit peeved when they got there because they found out that we had already been there before them, that the Apollo program was the public program, but not necessarily the program that was run by different agencies prior to that. And so as discussed in the book Alternative 3, there were constructions by the American military and perhaps to the Russians as well. I believe the Russians went to the moon, excuse me, either before us or the same time as we did, and they're just much better at keeping the intel to themselves. But they're quite forthright when they talk about extraterrestrial landings. We talked to several Russian scientists after the wall came down, and they were talking about these craft landing in abandoned air bases in the central steppes of Russia and what have you. So I think they've got some bases, we've got some bases, and also we have our extraterrestrial friends and visitors that have some bases too. To some degree, some of that has been moved to the backside of the moon because it is less susceptible. The conditions are better on the backside. They do not have the huge tidal gravitational pull that the Earth has on the moon on the front side. And so, just like anywhere else, the lower you go below sea level, whether it's Death Valley or the Red Sea or the Dead Sea rather, the lower you go below sea level, the more compressibility of the atmosphere occurs, and so it becomes denser and thicker. And so just like in the Grand Canyon, when you go down there at some times of the year, the compressibility can be quite stifling. The same thing is on the other planets as well. When you go down in the deep craters, the likelihood of more atmosphere being caught and compressed and water gathering, what have you, leads to, the color pictures that you mentioned before that are in our book as well. And description of what astronauts call that looks like a clear mountain lake in areas of green and brown vegetation and things like that. So where you get life, you get its variance and you get its progressiveness, and so it just doesn't stop there, any different than life doesn't stop here from 30,000 feet below the sea all the way to the top of the highest mountain.
And speaking of the sea, I wouldn't be surprised if bases exist on the bottom of the ocean for a couple reasons. One, to monitor us. Two, because we can't get down there because of the pressure. I would think that a lot of the submarines would literally crush under that pressure, especially when you're going down to, say, the Indian Ocean, which I believe is the deepest ocean. It just makes perfect sense. And I also, this is my own personal belief, and I want to get your opinion on this. I do believe that we have not only been visited long before Homo sapiens occupied this earth, but even before that, maybe going back millions and millions of years. What do you say about that?
In reality, I will say yes, because when you travel the cosmos and you travel through different solar systems and constructs, you get to see its development based upon that particular stage. So let's use an example and say, imagine we were 50 million years ago when the dinosaurs walked around the Earth, and the people came from another system and a flyby to investigate, and they came out and they looked down there and they saw the dinosaurs and what have you, and they noted all that data and continued on with their travels as they go from place to place. That's not traveling back in time per se. Because you could not travel back in time because you would have to deconstruct all the molecules that are currently present in order to do that. And nature doesn't work that way. It just doesn't exist. That would be total Armageddon. And so, but when you go to a place that exhibits its evolutionary phase as it was at that time, you can say, well, I'm looking at it how it looked 50 million years ago. And so this is how they are learning, by going not only regressively into the early stages of our planetary constructs and universe and solar systems, but they go forward as well. And so they go to areas where you have much more advancements of people and thinking and ways of doing life. And so, yes, they have visited us probably since the beginning of time, remembering that they too were constructed in this particular solar system about 4.5 billion years ago, and they had to go through their cycle as well. And then the people who came from other systems came to visit them. So what's preventing us is joining our so-called universal right in order to be able to exchange thoughts and concepts and intermix with peoples that come from other worlds and knowledge that comes from space, so that we may grasp our full inheritance. We have dumbed ourselves down to the sometimes lowest expectation here, and our society is beginning to slip and wane because of it. And the reason that you also see a large number of crafts coming in and out of the ocean is because they are monitoring this planet on its geophysical state along the fault lines, which of course are down there at the deepest sections. And so our sun is in the process of disintegration and decelerating, and that means the solar system will go as well. And so they are monitoring the planetary condition of every planet to see which one is most likely to go first in order to throw the balance out and begin this total wave of degeneration and then re-molecules, re-energizing in the black hole, and then this starts the whole process of creation again. And so they are firmly aware of the concepts of how things are working beyond this planet, where we turn on the TV and we talk about the theories about how the universe works. And this opinions and all of this. They are the knowers, and we are nothing more than the opinionated. And it's not to our great grasp of in need in order to, make something better of ourselves.
In the beginning, I mentioned Venus because that sticks out in my mind as to one of the places that one of the extraterrestrials told George that they were from. Can you tell not just me, but all the people listening, where else these ETs said they were from?
Well, George, been a number of them from other planets in our solar system.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to understand that size, distance, spin, gravitational construct, nature works on a balance of principles. And as we well know, nature works on an equilibrium. If anything's out of that equilibrium, it tries to bring it back to that neutral state. And so when you will notice that as you look at the solar system, the spin of planets, the speed that are smaller compared to the largers, and the amount of mass which will absorb the solar rays, because the sun doesn't give off heat, it gives off radiation. Everybody knows that, but they don't pay any attention to it. Radiation has to interact with a medium in order to create heat. Otherwise, space would be warmer as you got closer to the sun instead of staying constant, what it is not. And so mass also, due to magnetism, will attract more of the solar rays and higher concentration. So the conditions that are developed and exist on our other worlds are quite different from what we imagine. It's sort of like the Kennedy assassination. We decided to pick the Patsy Oswald and make everything fit to him. And the same things happen in space. We have picked a particular dogma, and we are going to smash all the information we can to that dogma and ignore everything else.
Panspermia is one of the theories of how Earth was populated by Homo sapiens. Was George ever told, especially since many of these beings, or if I'm not mistaken, all of them, had literally human features, originated from another planet, maybe another galaxy, and were brought on Earth to live?
The discussion is that the natural evolution of life on the planet, coming from the organic synthesis that rained down from us from space, and slowly start the process of germination and beginnings of life, is relegated to the constructs of the natural world, but not human beings. There is no link between the primates and the human beings. And it doesn't make any difference how much you look like it. It doesn't mean that the chromosomes are the same. And to prove it, how come no more monkeys are turning into people anymore? It's suddenly miraculously has stopped for some reason. So the discussion, not only with George, but among many scientists who I have associated with, and Maurice Chatelain, who holds the telecommunications patents for Apollo, wrote a book called Our Ancestors Came from Outer Space. He also lists all the space flights and all of them that had UFOs, which was every single one of them encountered during that time. So the idea that the Homo sapiens were brought here is one that is well circulated, because there is no link between us and the rest of the natural world. And it was once described to George that there are a race of people that travel space, and they pollinate and populate planets as they come to systems that are sustainable towards people, which is the purpose of everything.
Now, you mentioned George, and actually, as a matter of fact, I believe one of the books, I think you said, is Inside Flying Saucers. How many times has George Adamski been inside the craft, and not only been inside them, but has been taken for a ride? And if through those times he's been taken for a ride, how many times has he been taken to other planets, other solar systems, maybe even other galaxies, or just anywhere aside from Earth and just space?
I would say that it's uncountable times. I'll just venture a guesstimate of what I know of, probably 36 times,
wow,
perhaps more than that. But he also mentioned the fact that every time he went up into space, there were people from the establishment, recognizable individuals that were accompanied as well. He was not the only passenger. And so I remember a time when J. Edgar Hoover was after everything that sounded communistic or what have you, and he wanted to go after George, and George says, fine, put me on the stand, testimony. I'll give you the dates and times and names of everybody who was on there with me. And all the cases were dropped. In fact, I have the FBI file of that here in my archive. And so so I would say that he went up into space more than enough times to give us accurate information. And I think his visits to other planets, at least two that I'm aware of, were quite revealing as well.
Which planets, and were they in our solar system, like Venus?
They were in our solar system, yes, absolutely, and there were several of them. And so, but all the planets to one form or another sustains intelligent life, so it's not just any particular ones. We just happen to have neighbors, and we have neighbors within the entire cosmos. In fact, there was just a quote out by the Russian scientist who said, "The universe is full of life. The Earth has no monopoly on life. The universe is full of planets in every possible stage of development." And that was Dr. Yuri Raul. And he's not the only one. I mean, my God, so many people have talked out and spoken about that in their contacts and the information that is brought to us of a progressive nature. Today's UFO field is all negative. Let me scare you, frighten you, play with your mind and thoughts, and physically accost you. And nobody comes from space to do these things to you. First of all, you're not special. The human genome is throughout the universe. And secondly, you get no decent scientific data from harassing the subject. If I chase the chicken all over the courtyard, what kind of data am I going to get from the chicken when I finally catch him? They don't come and take your cows. They never did, never will, and don't have to. And so, unfortunately, the circus that this field has become perpetuates the ridicule and the skepticism amongst the public, as they should. I tell everybody, question everybody. Question me, question everybody. Don't let a single speaker at a UFO convention get away without nailing him down. Where is your proof? And then you look at most of them coming up empty-handed.
That's right. That's absolutely right. All they have is their own word. And another thing I've noticed, and I've spoken about this on the show and also off the show with friends such as the owner of this network, Joe Montaldo, where I've noticed that a lot of the reports that have been circulating in the last decade or two or even further are basically recycled stories with just another added piece of I hesitate to use the word fiction, but another piece of not even glamour, but something more interesting. Especially recently, some people toting around this theory that we have these blue avians that visit Earth. I mean, really? Giant blue big birds visiting us? That somehow doesn't seem to make sense. Have you heard about that?
Well, let's look at this right at its core. First of all, as I mentioned before, any chemical biologist or exobiologist tells you that the atoms and the molecules go together a certain way. They do not go together unnaturally. Nature doesn't allow that. That's what the principle of magnetism, which governs all of creation, is there for. The attraction, repulsion of magnetism, molecules, and atoms, and quirks, and so on and so forth. And so when you look at that, you find out that the evolution of not only the natural world, but the construct of the Homo sapiens is on par no matter where you go. This is not Star Wars bar scene. This is not Star Trek Beam Me Up, Scotty. This all imaginative stuff where you've got 5 eyes or you got 3 octopus nose or, big, huge feet that are webbed. I mean, this is all stuff we have come to accept because we are bombarded with science fiction day and night and night and day. And we don't question it. and we don't question it. But if you look at the principles of the construct of life, Dr. Panampura wrote about it. He said, don't be surprised when you land on another world and somebody walks up to shake your hand, because the principles of life are consistent throughout the cosmos. And he's not the only one who said that. And so I had a symposium many years, what was now, 5 years ago in the Southwest, in which I talked to several scientists that were quite notary on their field, and we had a little discussion and a group gathering at one fellow's house. And he says to the people, he says, you people have not a single concept of how intricate and how finely thought out the human form is. A lobster or a crayfish is not going to build a microcomputer chip. It does not have the physical capabilities or the intelligence to do that. This is all imaginary bull. And people don't like to hear that. That's why they don't like me talking at UFO conferences, because I strip it away like a banana, because they want to have the intergalactic federation of whatever, and all these different species are there. There are many different races, yes. Species, no.
Can you tell us what George Adamski learned from the visitors of how the craft operate?
Propulsion system works on electromagnetism, and the speed they are able to reproduce is twice the speed of light, which is the speed of magnetism of 360,000 miles per second.
Wow. And
now we know that the theories of Einstein that nothing could go faster than the speed of light and not induce time travel is not true, because we have clocked particles now within the atomic structure, and that was publicized already several years ago, and I'm always amazed at how many people are ignorant of that fact too. I mean, it's like, does anybody read anymore? So the speed of magnetism, you think about the distance to the moon of 249,000 some odd miles, when you're going these speeds, I mean, that's what, a little bit more than a quarter second, if that's what you were going to travel at. Now, they are much more cognizant of the acceleration and deceleration factor and what have you, like, in order to do that. But traveling beyond the solar system into other solar systems and beyond is not a technological difficulty for them. They have developed, and all they did was study nature. They used the principles of nature. They used the principle of the planet, which is a giant Van de Graaff generator that produces trillions of watts of electricity. We could tap into it, and we could power everything, but we don't want to, because our economy is structured a different way. And so that is what they are using to travel space, and that's some of things that was discussed.
You mentioned two of the crafts that Mr. Adamski saw. For instance, the giant cigar-shaped craft, and out of that came a flying saucer, which would have been, I think, what would have brought down the visitors to landing, as opposed to from the mothership, aka cigar-shaped object high above. Has he talked about any other shapes of these craft, like triangles or maybe pyramids or spheres or anything like that?
The discussion of how the electromagnetic field and the force field that envelops the craft is required, because they build their ships to adhere to the propulsion system, not the other way around. And so these shapes, cigar-shaped craft or saucer-shaped craft, is allowing the energy and the force that not only surrounds the craft but permeates through the skin of the craft to totally envelop it. And the faster it goes, the larger that field extends. So when you're looking at some of these cigar-shaped craft that are 30 miles long, the field that extends beyond them can be hundreds of miles long. In fact, if you look here on their web page again, about halfway down, just above Why Are They Here, there's a lunar shot in the middle of one of these cigar-shaped craft trailing the smaller ones in front of the moon. And let's see if there's any others. Maybe not. There's not on this particular bunch. But so this type of shape is required to use it in order to use the electromagnetic propulsion. Triangular shaped is our stuff. Spheres is their stuff, but that is remote control devices, what we call the the ones that were seen during World War II flying along adjacent to our bombers and other missions like that. Green, I can't remember the word right now, but they were spheres, and that's their robotics that are used to collect data. So stuff that has appendages, stuff that has fins, stuff that is triangular, these are all stuff that is constructed here on our own planet.
Interesting, as reverse engineered from their technology.
Well, I would say some of that can be a possibility. Also, I think we also experiment a great deal with what's called holographic projection,
yes,
in which you can take something that's small and holograph it into something that's very big, but that doesn't mean that the entire form is 100% substance. And so we are mixed up in a great deal of research and development in many different levels on producing these type of craft, and so one has to be very careful. I would say these days only about 15% of what we see is real. The rest of us, about 50% of it is our stuff, and a certain amount of it is misidentification due to weather phenomena and what have you. But if we looked at Project Blue Book, when they came out, they said that about 15% of all the sightings could not be explained, and when you look at the money as 800 per day, that still is quite a substantial amount. And I don't think that many is still today, because we have misidentified, like I said, with weather and drones and other stuff that the military works with, and so we need to be careful that not everything in the sky is a extraterrestrial craft.
Project Blue Book, which was, for those who don't know, and if they don't know what it is, you literally must be living under a rock if you're paying attention to UFOs or ufology or anything of this such, was a program initiated by the United States Air Force, and they used an astronomer, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, as the lead investigator to debunk the cases. And that's where the so-called swamp gas explanation came from. Because, Glenn, if this started in 1947 and lasted through 1969, this would have fallen before and after George Adamski's visitations up until his death. I'm assuming that they probably spoke to George Adamski more than once?
Sure. They used to come up to the property all the time. Originally, they send the men in black up there to try to scare him, and they told him that if he doesn't shut up, they'll chain him to the back of the car and drag him down the mountain. But George already had information that they were coming, and he knew who their supervisors were. So he called up the commanding officer and said to them, hey, listen, if you don't stop this garbage, I'm just going to reveal who these people are, and you're going to be a front-page newspaper in the San Diego Union. And so they tended to back off a little bit because, fortunately for George, he had friends and access and extraterrestrial, shall we say, support that helped to keep him safe. And but if you look at 47, and I don't believe Blue Book was at 47, but the report came out in the 50s. Ruppel's book, the report on unidentified flying objects, came out before Blue Book. And but to a great extent, most of this is coming from Kenneth Arnold and Roswell. Now, remember, flying saucers did not come from Kenneth Arnold. That term that already came from 1876 in the Denison Daily News, where they witnessed this craft, and they called it a flying saucer. So that the real history is much further back in the United States than it was from Kenneth Arnold. But this is what happens today. A known event, whether it happens to be Roswell or any other one of them, and they take that and they twist it. They rewrite the history. And there's an ongoing movement for the last 15 years to totally reconstruct UFO history to prevent the current generations from really seeing it or accessing it or recognizing it. Twist the story. And so in Roswell's case, the bodies were recovered. None were alive. Afterwards, one of these personalities walked around and said, well, one of them survived, and we captured them, and he lived with the Indians, and he taught them, and so on and so forth. Nothing. Garbage. All 5 bodies were removed, taken to Texas, and then on to Wright-Patterson after that, in which there were some in Walter Reed at one point, too. And so a known event is taken and twisted and turned because people don't really know, so they're left guessing. And unfortunately, this tool of keeping people guessing is used consistently in this field, so they really don't get a solid grasp of anything, and that way they go nowhere with it. They become bored or unsatisfied, and then they put it aside, and that's exactly what is intended for you, to leave it alone so that you don't keep asking annoying questions.
Exactly. By instilling fear into people, I could see how they don't want to talk about it or keep asking questions. And it seemed to be somewhat successful because in that period, sure, there were some amazing cases. For instance, Lonnie Zamora in New Mexico, which he was a police officer, a credible witness who not only saw I don't want to say a disc, but a craft landed. He was able to draw the insignia on it and even talked about the beings outside of it. Yet everything in Project Blue Book seemed to be the same goal: ridicule and make the person look like a fool so as to not believe their story. And clearly, with Mr. Adamski, they failed big time, definitely.
Well, what's funny is that, of course, everybody came to know that Hynek was selected in order to ridicule everything. The same thing happened with the Condon report that came out there when Nixon was inaugurated. And if you talk to Paula Harris, who is also a personality in this field that worked for Hynek, she would say that he was terribly torn between his conscience and what he was told to say. Yes. But the interesting thing is, my father corresponded with him several times, and I have the newspaper clipping where he's holding up the picture of the scout craft, as you have in the website here at the very bottom in the middle of one of the bell-shaped craft that was photographed. And the quotation says that Dr. Hynek has changed his mind and he is not ridiculing the subject anymore. And it's funny that he did it by holding a picture of George Adamski's bell-shaped craft. But you have to understand that people were under an immense amount of strain and stress. For people who are unaware of James Forrestal, who was the Secretary of, I believe, of State or Defense in the late 1940s, who was assassinated. They tried to call it suicide, but they shoved him out of the window in New York. He was very much vocal on this particular field. Admiral Hillenkotter, who became a director of NICAP, the agency to investigate this as well, began in the late 50s, and I believe in 59, and then was ridiculed out of it. And so the type of forces that dictated policy and events have changed a bit, not so much as to who they are, but how they work. They're not stupid. They work with the psychology of people, and God knows we make it really easy on them to do that to us.
Did George ever mention how these ETs communicated with him? Because a lot of people say that it's through telepathy as opposed to verbalizing something out of their mouths.
There's both. Telepathy is a natural communication method. In fact, they gave him the information, which he put in 3 booklets: Telepathy, part 1, 2, and 3, which we have available to the public. But telepathy is a picture language, and all of nature uses it. You communicate with your animals, you communicate with your plants, you can communicate with each other through this picture. In other words, let's say, I need you to call me. So I picture your face, I picture the telephone, and if you are being receptive, you'll get this thought, I better call Glenn. And there you call, and there it goes. It is not a word, it's not a process like channeling. Nobody speaks through you, you speak through yourself. And it's a method upon which you can communicate anywhere, anytime. Distance means nothing. they do have a spoken language as well. And on times when he met people from the ships in later times, they had learned our language with a slight accent. And they do it based like on musical chords, isn't it? You know, in a way, it's funny because you remember a famous song that you liked when you were a kid, and that was 30, 40 years ago, and you still remember the lyrics because it's an association with music. And they can learn languages very quickly based upon that same process and way of doing things.
I've always had the belief that we, Homo sapiens, have always had the ability to have telepathy, but somewhere down the line, it's almost as if those higher up in the government, through poisoning or other methods, found a way to dumb us down and to prevent us from having the ability to openly have telepathy, almost as if they made us lose our confidence in doing so. And moreover, for whatever reason, when we speak words, just as I'm speaking to you and the listeners are hearing, what we have to do is first you have to put in your head what you're going to say, and then you vocalize it. But telepathy bypasses all that, and it goes from brain to brain. Isn't that the best way to describe it?
Sure, absolutely. And we don't have anybody to blame but ourselves. The reason that we don't have access to these things we had in ancient times. In ancient times, we had access to the scientific use of vibration in order to levitate. Telepathy was used. They were not as bombarded with so much excess media and microwave and everything else that we are today. And so in a way, we have given it up. I saw a quote the other day that said, it would be nice if we didn't put our children into school for 12 years to learn garbage in order to come out into the classroom of life and try to unlearn it. And the fact is true. We don't teach anything of any substance. We poo-hoo anything that doesn't come to our particular thoughts or concept. Reincarnation is as real as you can get. And yet, if it's a day and night fight with the religious extremists who don't want any of that taught. And so the parents are dropping the ball at home. They themselves don't care or want to. And that's where the foundation of learning comes from. And so we are not the examples to our children, and we pass them off and don't want to be annoyed with them, and so on and so forth. And we are totally enveloped in a society where you've got to have the next biggest house, you have to have a $60,000 SUV, you got to have this, you got to have that, so you got to work like a dog until you drop dead. Well, what hell kind of life is that? That's nonsense.
It's exactly opposite of living, especially if you're living a materialistic life for showing off. I would think that goes against what these intelligent extraterrestrials are trying to show us of what we're actually capable of.
Right. Well, they produce on their planet the very best. In other words, you don't get a Volkswagen and you don't get a Cadillac. You get the very best car that their technology, let's say they're not used cars, but the very best vehicle that their technology can produce. And that's it. They don't divide and they don't, what's the word I'm looking for? Division is one of the biggest ones. They don't divide people by race, by income level, by I've got this and you don't. The entire society is producing the best refrigerator on the market, and there it is. You get one of them. Good for you. But we don't do that way. We produce.
I was just going to say, same with TVs and every other appliance or everything else that is available to consumers.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Now, a few, or if not all, of the extraterrestrials that Mr. Adamski had contact with told him their names. Am I right?
No, he gave them names.
And
he gave them names in respect to their characteristics. And so when he says in his book that he met a gentleman. It says he met a gentleman whom he called Orthon. And in ancient text, that means the noble one. So no, they did not produce names for them. They wouldn't need to. Their identification is they themselves, not only their face, but then the thought of them. So, well, what does a word mean? Nothing. You can say John in English, and it means nothing in Russian, and even less in Mongolian.
That's right. That's right. Aside from the name that he gave one of the extraterrestrials, Orthon, can you tell us some other names that Mr. Adamski named them in, I guess you could say, the English language, or at least terrestrial linear languages?
Well, he named one Ramu, another one Furkan, and he had other names as well. And that's the only reason he gave them those names, is so they could be identified in the book whom he was referring to. So he was simply using our own mentality in order to get the message across.
Has there been anyone since George Adamski that has had this level of contacts to the point that that person can invite people to a certain location and consistently see these extraterrestrial craft and even the beings themselves?
No. First of all, anybody who tells you that these craft respond to them is full of hokum. And this is how it works. If you go to an airport, you can expect to see airplanes. If you go to certain places during particular times, you can expect to see more UFO activity. For instance, about an hour and a half after sunset, if you're in an area where there's low light pollution, the electromagnetic terminator, or the line between light and dark, has passed, and the north and south pole magnetic field is extremely vibrant. And they travel on these particular fields, so at particular times you can see them. And then some people say, oh, look, it's flashing at me because I'm waving at it. No, the craft skips out and in of the ionosphere as it's coming across the top of the atmosphere, which causes the glow to go on brighter at some times and dimmer at other times. And so there are plenty of people in this field who love to abuse and misuse, once again, in order for their own self-marketing. So if you go out at this particular time, an hour and a half after sunset or about 4 a.m. in some areas, you may, at some times, see some of these crafts. And we've gone out to Mount Palomar several times, and on occasion we've seen half a dozen, and other times none at all. And that has nothing to do with me or anybody else's specialty. It's putting yourself at the airport to see airplanes. And so I take great measure against people who love to misinform. I find it so difficult to understand how anyone in this field could purposely go in front of people who are open in their thinking and their desire to know and purposely mislead them. That's like a teacher coming and prowling in front of the first graders, and from the time on they sat their young minds into that seat, telling them nothing but garbage. And I find that despicable, and I tell them so.
Especially since they're doing a disservice to all of humanity. And like you said, the people who are not just debunkers, but embellishing stories that are not real, it sort of makes this field be ridiculed. And obviously there are debunkers who are paid large sums of money to debunk what's actually happening. There are several reasons that I can never understand why they would hide from us that, hey, us living on this rock called Earth is not the only occupied planet, but yet they seem to have us believe that. Now we have 15 minutes left, literally till the end of the show, and I want to leave the last 5 minutes to plug in everything that you have to plug in and things like that. For instance, some of your books, which I believe are Fred's your father, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So now you've mentioned seeing craft. Are the craft that you've seen at Mount Palomar, or have they been at various locations? And if you were just to estimate, how many different times you've seen these craft. What would you say?
I couldn't even begin to count how many I've seen. Once again, many years ago, we were so busy in the field and so immersed with the subject and George's contacts. There were times when it was just an everyday occurrence. The intelligence community used to park a car of two agents down at the bottom of the driveway from where we were staying. And my father said to me, "Come on down, let's go ahead and visit these guys and bring them some coffee." And so we'd go down there and bring him a thermos of coffee. And on one occasion, he took a flashlight and he flashed a series of high-intensity beams into the night sky, crystal clear, no clouds, no reflection. And within 5 seconds, that beam, except for 10 times stronger, shined right down on top of us and the car, and took off the CIA agents, and the next night we had a different one. I mean, I can remember so many circumstances. As a professional pilot, I've seen them over the North Atlantic, coming out of the jungles of Brazil. I'm not going to say it's an everyday occurrence or that, once again, that I'm anything special. It's just simply that I keep an open eye and keep looking. While most people are stumbling along the streets with their eyes buried in their cell phone, I'm looking up at the skies a little bit more than that. And I think anybody who does that will have a good opportunity to see something too. Remember, as we mentioned, the thought is important. If you hold the thought in your mind, you're transmitting it telepathically. And so somebody who may be flying by might pick it up and say, "Okay, let's do a low flyover, a buzz." Give you something to look at and think about. So you've got to hold an open thought in order to get anywhere with anything you do in your life.
Throughout all these sightings that you have seen, have you actually run into or come into contact with the beings piloting these ships?
Yes.
And I know it'd be hard for you to tell the number of times you've had sightings, but can you estimate about how many times you've had visitations or contact with these beings?
Oh, I would say maybe a dozen times.
Would you say these beings that you have come into contact with are the same as Mr. Adamski, meaning that they're human-like, to what we look like, as far as not just humanoid, but like earlier you mentioned, some may look like Middle Eastern, some may look like from other parts of the world, but essentially they're all looking like Homo sapiens. Have you ever come across anything that would be, as some people would put, like a insectoid or a reptilian?
No, as we talked about earlier, based upon the principles of biochemistry, molecular construct, that doesn't exist. Absolutely.
More for fear.
Well, I think it is because the subject is polluted. And not only that, what you see on science fiction is replicated right away afterwards. Nobody talked about Stargate until the movie came out, and then all of a sudden Stargates were everywhere with UFOs, and they were all generated by pyramids and so on and so forth. Our whole method of thinking is basically copycat. Somebody puts out a thought, and there we go, we grab it. You watch the movie Alien or Armageddon or any one of these movies, and for 3 days you can't think straight, and then you dream about this stuff because that's the purpose, to impregnate it within your mind. Anything that comes from space is supposed to be terrifying rather, and therefore you're supposed to stay away from it. The reason they want you to stay away from it is not because it's going to do you bodily harm. They're more worried about our people on this world is that you'll get an idea about how to change things and how this planet is run, and that they fear more than anything. And so it has to do with positive nature. So they're just using the psychosis of negativity and creature features because they know that's what people grab. They love to be satiated and they love to be scared.
Since George Adamski passed away, has there been anyone that has had the what's the proper word? I don't want to say, I guess, magnitude of sightings as well as contacts as he did?
None that I'm aware of.
Now let's talk about you and what you're doing exactly for the Adamski Foundation. I did mention in the beginning you're the CEO and director. What do you see as the future of the Adamski Foundation, aside from keeping this very, very, very important, I don't want to say just story, I'm talking about, a long period of his life alive?
We exist primarily to serve as a factual, foundational information source in regards to this field. And in order to do that, we will go out and go among the public. Every time I go, I do it on my own expense. I do not take honorariums or anything of that nature. I believe it's foul to try to milk this for financial gain. And that's why stories, as you said before, magically seem to change over time, because everybody who wants to come out and write a new book or say something else or appear on the lecture circuit, and they don't like to be, they want to give somebody something new. That's always the answer. What do you got new to sensationalize this? Well, what about something that you haven't even thought about for so long? It's old. But we produce as much material as possible, and go wherever we're asked to go or invited, as is in this show, which I appreciate, in order to give people something to think about and to look at, and to perhaps provide an avenue of desire to understand more that's outside our regular, everyday, methodical lives. And so I will continue to do this, obviously, until I pass, and I'm not going to worry about it after that.
Have a lot of people tried to debate you, aside from the debunkers, whose main job is to literally be paid to debunk everything? Have people tried to debate you and say, well, hold on, George Adamski's contacts and sightings and evidence, photographic evidence, is all just a big ruse to create attention towards him, as opposed to it actually happening?
If you look on our website at adamskifoundation.com, you'll find the scientific analysis of the photographs and the crafts and the triangular trigonometry that is involved to show that they're not models, they're not fakes. We provide hard, tangible evidence, while they provide nothing but attacks and innuendo. I have no trouble handling these people. I've been doing this all my life. I know who they are. I know how they think, and more importantly, I know how they operate. And so I have sent out a lot of material here just last year with the new book and everything out to all of the major names in this field. Not one of them responded. Not one of them. And so when it comes to Adamski's books and materials and ours, like our Moon book, they'll use it on every special and every documentary, but they will never give credit to the book or the author itself, because they have been told to ostracize Adamski, because they are scared to death of the fact that people who look like you and I, who can walk amongst us, will bring us something of a betterment of this world and society. That's what scares us the most, not the boogeyman.
And that's actually a really scary thought, trying to suppress this information. I know this is in the public domain, but since I have you on air, for those listeners, especially the younger listeners, how many books did George Adamski write chronicling his contact with these extraterrestrials?
The first book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, was co-authored with Sir Desmond Leslie. You might recognize the name Castle Leslie in Ireland. He was a very big supporter of George, along with Lord Mountbatten, who was assassinated by the Irish in, I believe, 1973, and some other people that were working with George during the 1959 World Tour. That's the first. The second book is Inside the Spaceship, which is all of George's book. The third book is called Flying Saucers Farewell, which was redone as Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery, and that secondary edition you'll see the picture of on the website that you posted as well. That has a lot of current information on it. Then there were telepathy course, the science of life course, how these people live, and numerous other publications that smaller booklets and things, the cosmic philosophy, the bulletin that was put out every 3 months and things like that. So there's a large volume of materials that was generated by George in relationship to this. And we have added to that with Why Are They Here?, which was my father's first book, and that has to do with his relationship, our relationship with George and his space contacts. And then Alien Bases on the Moon to prove that we had our own scientific information that correlated with NASA's, that showed activity on the moon, which you can see the pictures once again on the website you posted. Craters with an S in it, a long cigar-shaped craft next to it. Those are Lunar Orbiter 4 pictures. A cloud hanging over the crater. Tracks of vehicles across the surface and things like that. So we wanted to show that collaborative evidence so that people would take another hard look at the information and decide for themselves what George said, and not what some stupid critic who only is repeating over and over again what they found on the internet, to try to debunk it all.
Now, since I did mention your father, Fred, how many books has he written since the passing of George Adamski?
He wrote the 2 books, Why Are They Here?, and the first edition of Alien Bases on the Moon. And then in '97, after his passing, I added a couple chapters to it and made it Alien Bases on the Moon 2. And that was his 2 major publications. And he spoke in God knows how many countries and continents across the world, and was well received. And he had also taken motion picture film of UFOs outside of the airplane as we crossed the North Atlantic, and also in Germany as we were traveling on the train. So he was well known for his own UFO photographs as well. So George was very confident about both my parents' ability to carry on the true work. And when they passed away, then the mantle fell to me, and I felt as the last surviving member, it would do a great injustice by not carrying the torch forward.
Glenn, it has been an honor to speak to you, and I know this is going to be the first of many times I will have you back on the show. I truly hoped you enjoyed it as well as I did. And before we get off air, I want to give you this opportunity to plug in whatever you want. You mentioned the Adamski Foundation. Anything you want to talk about for the listeners to know. The floor is yours, my friend.
I think people should understand that we have an immense ability to do good, and we often just simply ignore that ability because it's easier to do what we want versus what needs to be done. The space people are truly our brother's keeper. They believe in thy will shall be done, not our will be done. So they come to us with purpose and with openness. And I think that if we want any true progress, we have to learn to understand it and embrace it. And so when you listen to the UFO field, if it's negative and aggressive and threatening, let it go. It is of no value. And I think that if you do that, you'll have a much better understanding of this field.
Well said. Glenn Steckling, everybody. Real quick, I just want to throw some shout outs out there. First, my social media manager and my audiovisual engineer, Miss Pam Vrettenberg, and her website, UnitedTruthSeekers.com. Also, my assistant producer, as well as my VP of Operations, Josh Terrace. And of course, I want to thank the owner of this great network, United Public Radio Network, which is UPRN, Mr. Joe Montaldo. And also in the United Kingdom, I want to thank JC of Deprogram Radio Network for carrying this show as well. Remember, folks, we'll be back Thursday, same time, same place, and with another great guest talking about extraterrestrials and ufology. And real quick, let me remind you of something that I tell you every show, folks. The only thing you have to remember with regards to the show is the name of it, Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live. The website, drjradiolive.com. every social media account from YouTube, BitTube, Minds, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, Google+, whatever you could think of, Snapchat even. It's all the same word. It's at DRJ Radio Live. I try to make it very simple for you folks to find us. And with that being said, I want to thank you all. And you in the UK and Europe, you have a great morning. And for those of you east of the UK and EU, will have a good day. And for those of you in the United States, you have a good night. And now I officially am signing off.
You're clear, Ugly.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, he just hung up a second ago. Have you ever spoken to him before?
I don't know if I have. It sounds familiar, but be 100%. I don't really remember anymore.
Tell you the truth, this is the first time I did a show on Adamski, like wholly on Adamski, and I gotta say it was pretty good. Obviously, he doesn't like other things like talking about reptilians, if you heard Greys or anything like that.
Oh yeah,
Hey,
you don't want to talk about none of that. But that's all the old timers never do. They all get set in one particular thing. It doesn't matter which one it is. It might be human aliens, might be reptilians, might be tall whites, might be whatever.
yeah.
But they get stuck in that, and they can't seem to get out of it for some reason.
I was trying to get him to open. I was trying to open the door to him that during Adamski's time, they were saying they're from Venus or in our solar system, and then as time progressed, they're from planets that are not in our solar system. Then as time progressed even further, other galaxies, and then as time is recently, they're from other dimensions and other timelines, things like that. I get the impression that they're lying to us. I don't know if you've heard about this, but there was this case in the late 1800s where this trackless train was coming, and this rancher saw it, and basically the train had stopped again with no tracks. And the rancher took great interest in it, and he said something along the line of,